Keanu thought he was just saving a dog, but what happened next will blow your mind. You won't believe the bond they formed. Watch until the end. Keanu Reeves saddled up his horse early that morning, ready to head out to a remote part of his ranch where he was set to film a scene. He had been to this part of the ranch many times before, so he was familiar with the rugged land. But the recent storms had changed the terrain. The ground was soaked, and the weather had left parts of the land unpredictable. Keanu knew the swampy areas were especially dangerous after the storms, with mud and water mixing to create deep, hidden pockets that could trap anything unlucky enough to wander too far. As Keanu guided his horse through the thick mist, he took in the peaceful surroundings. The morning air was cool and crisp, and the trees along the path seemed to sway gently in the breeze. The world felt still, as if the land itself was taking a moment to breathe. Keanu appreciated the quiet. It was his time to clear his mind before the hectic filming schedule began. The calmness of nature had always been something he cherished, and out here, it felt like he could just be himself, away from the noise of the world. He pushed forward through the rough path, the soft crunch of his horse's hooves the only sound breaking the stillness. But as he traveled further into the land, something changed. There was a faint sound on the breeze, almost like a cry. At first, Keanu thought it was just the wind rustling the trees or a bird calling out in the distance. But then it came again, a soft, desperate whine that cut through the morning fog. Keanu immediately felt something shift in him. His instincts, honed from years of being in the wild, told him this was no ordinary sound. It was a cry for help. His heart quickened as the realization hit him. It wasn't just the noise of an animal or bird. This was something more urgent. He had heard cries like this before, when an animal was in danger or trapped, struggling to escape. Without hesitation, Keanu pulled the reins, halting his horse. He listened carefully, trying to pinpoint the exact location of the sound. The cry was faint, but it was unmistakable, a weak, pleading noise that echoed through the stillness of the land. Keanu's gaze swept across the foggy landscape, his eyes scanning for any movement. He didn't know what it was yet, but he could feel the urgency in the air. Something needed his help. He urged his horse forward, more cautiously now, trying to follow the sound. Each step felt heavy as his senses sharpened. The peaceful morning atmosphere that had surrounded him moments before had shifted into something tense, charged with the unknown. Keanu's grip on the reins tightened, and his eyes focused ahead, fully aware that time was running out. The cry came again, louder this time, and Keanu's heart sank. He knew he had to act quickly. He had no idea what he would find, but his gut told him it was serious. Without wasting another moment, he urged his horse faster, guiding him toward the direction of the cry. The fog began to lift slightly, and the trees started to thin out. Keanu's mind raced, but he kept his focus. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this felt different. Whatever was in trouble, it was waiting for him. And he wasn't going to let it down. As Keanu approached the source of the cry, the fog slowly began to lift, and his eyes focused on something unexpected. There, in front of him, was a dog, trapped in the swamp. The dog was struggling, its small body buried in the thick, sticky mud. With every movement, it sank deeper into the swamp. The dog's eyes were wide with fear, and its legs were tangled in the muck, making it impossible to free itself. Keanu's heart raced as he watched the dog's desperate attempts to escape. It was clear that the animal was exhausted, its breathing ragged. Every time the dog tried to pull itself free, it only sank further into the mud. The swamp had a grip on the dog, and with each passing second, it seemed to be losing the battle. Keanu knew the dangers of the swamp all too well. He had spent enough time on his ranch to understand how easily something, whether animal or human, could get trapped in the muck. The thick mud, combined with the stagnant water, could quickly turn a simple misstep into a life-or-death situation. He had seen animals fall victim to it before, and most of them never made it out. His mind raced as he took in the scene before him. The dog wasn't just stuck, it was running out of time. Keanu knew that if he didn't act quickly, the dog would be lost forever. The more the dog struggled, the deeper it sank. It was a terrifying sight, and Keanu could feel the urgency growing inside him. He had to do something now. Keanu dismounted from his horse, Shadow, and took a few steps toward the dog. The mud was thick and slippery, making every step a challenge. Keanu was careful not to get stuck himself. The last thing he wanted was to get caught in the swamp, too. But the dog needed him, and he wasn't going to let it down. The closer he got to the dog, the more he could see just how bad the situation was. The dog was trembling, its body covered in thick mud. Its eyes locked onto Keanu's, full of fear but also a hint of hope. The dog seemed to sense that help had arrived, but it was too weak to move or free itself. Keanu could see the exhaustion in its small frame. It had been struggling for too long. Keanu's mind was clear, and his hands moved with purpose. He knew he had to be careful. One wrong move, and both he and the dog could get stuck in the swamp. The thick muck could swallow them both if they weren't careful. He moved slowly, each step measured, as he made his way closer to the dog. When he reached the dog, Keanu kneeled down beside it, speaking softly to reassure it. "It's okay," he said in a calm voice. "I've got you. Just hold on." He could feel the dogs trembled beneath his hand, but he knew time was of the essence. The dog needed to be freed now, or it might not survive the swamp's grip. Keanu's hands worked quickly, grabbing the rope from his saddle. He knew he had to tie it around the dog's legs, but he had to be gentle. The last thing he wanted was to scare the dog more. The rope would give him a way to pull the dog out, but it was a delicate operation. Every second felt like a lifetime as Keanu tied the rope, all while keeping an eye on the dog's movements. The thick mud was relentless, but Keanu was determined. The dog wasn't alone anymore. Keanu was going to make sure it made it out of the swamp, no matter what it took. Without wasting a moment, Keanu dismounted from his horse, Shadow, and rushed toward the dog. The terrain was treacherous, with thick mud that made every step a challenge. But Keanu's calm determination pushed him forward. He knew he had to act quickly, every second counted. The dog's struggles were getting weaker, and the swamp was closing in fast. As Keanu moved closer, he spoke softly to the dog, trying to keep it calm. "It's okay. You're going to be okay," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. The dog, exhausted and trapped, seemed to calm slightly as it heard Keanu's words. There was something in the tone of his voice, something that made the dog feel a little safer, despite the situation. Keanu steadied himself and carefully looped a rope around the dog's legs. He had to be gentle, not wanting to cause the dog any more panic. The mud was deep and sticky, making the job harder, but Keanu knew this was the only way to get the dog out of the swamp. He made sure the rope was secure before preparing to pull the dog free. The dog struggled at first, its body fighting against the pull. Keanu could see the fear and exhaustion in its eyes, but he kept his voice calm and steady. "It's okay, little one. Just hold on," he murmured. Keanu's calm presence seemed to help. With every word, the dog's panic eased just a little, making it easier for Keanu to begin pulling. The mud was thick and unyielding, and every time Keanu pulled, it felt like the swamp was trying to hold on to the dog. His muscles strained, the effort demanding more than he had expected. But Keanu didn't stop. He focused on the task at hand, his mind clear and determined. The dog's life depended on him, and he couldn't afford to give up. Keanu's boots sank into the mud with each pull, and the effort was wearing on him. But he kept going, pulling with everything he had. He knew that if he stopped, even for a moment, the dog might sink deeper. His body ached, and his arms burned with the effort, but Keanu didn't back down. The dog's body was trembling, its small legs shaking as Keanu pulled harder. For a moment, it felt like the swamp was winning, but Keanu refused to let it. He gave one last powerful tug, pulling with all his strength. The rope tightened, and the dog's body finally broke free from the muck. Keanu stumbled back slightly, exhausted, but he held onto the rope as the dog collapsed onto solid ground. The dog lay there for a moment, shaking and gasping for breath, its body covered in thick mud. Keanu knelt beside it, his heart pounding from the effort. The dog was safe now, but it still needed to recover. Keanu spoke softly, "You made it. You're okay now." His words were meant to comfort, and he could see the dog's eyes soften, the panic slowly fading. It was clear that the dog was exhausted, but it was alive. And that was all that mattered. Keanu had done it. The dog was free from the swamp, and the crisis was over. But the bond formed in that moment, between Keanu and the dog, was something neither of them would ever forget. The dog collapsed onto solid ground, its small body trembling with exhaustion. It lay there, breathing heavily, clearly drained from the struggle in the swamp. Keanu knelt beside it, his heart still racing from the effort of pulling the dog out. The sight of the dog, covered in mud and shaking, hit him hard. He could hardly believe that it was finally safe. Keanu had expected the dog to run away once it was freed, to run back to the wild, where it belonged. But to his surprise, the dog didn't move. Instead, it stayed still, its muddy face turning toward him. For a brief moment, the dog's eyes locked onto Keanu's. It was a silent gaze, filled with an unspoken understanding that went beyond words. In that moment, Keanu felt something shift. He had always been in control, calm and composed in any situation, but this was different. The dog wasn't just a creature he had saved, there was something more, something deeper. Keanu felt a connection that he hadn't expected, and it touched him in a way he couldn't explain. The dog didn't show any signs of running off. Instead, it seemed drawn to Keanu. Its eyes followed him as he stood up, and slowly, it began to stir, pushing itself up with shaking legs. Keanu watched, unsure of what would happen next. But to his surprise, the dog didn't try to move away from him. It took a few hesitant steps forward, its tired body swaying slightly, as if it was following him. Keanu stood there, motionless for a moment, unsure of how to react. He had just saved this dog's life, yet it seemed to trust him in a way he had never expected. The dog had every reason to run away, to go back to its wild life, but instead, it was staying close, as if it wanted to be with Keanu. Keanu took a cautious step forward, and the dog followed him. It wasn't chasing him, but rather staying right behind him, its eyes never leaving his back. Keanu couldn't help but feel a deep sense of wonder. What was happening? Why was this dog, after all it had been through, choosing to stay with him? The dog, despite its wild circumstances and the fear it must have felt, seemed to be forming a bond with Keanu. It wasn't just a rescue anymore. There was something more happening between them, something that Keanu couldn't quite understand. He had always known that animals could form bonds with humans, but this felt different. The dog's loyalty, despite everything, was undeniable. Keanu was left stunned. As he glanced down at the dog, his thoughts raced. He had never expected this moment to turn into something more than just a rescue. He had saved a life, yes, but now he was left questioning what this meant. Was the dog simply grateful? Or was there something else at play, something that Keanu hadn't yet realized? All Keanu knew was that this was just the beginning of something far bigger than he could have ever imagined. The dog had made a choice, and that choice would change both of their lives forever. As Keanu walked beside the dog, he couldn't help but reflect on everything that had just happened. What started as a simple rescue had turned into something much deeper. The dog, once trapped and alone in the swamp, was now walking alongside him, following him with a trust that Keanu hadn't expected. The bond between them formed in such an unlikely way, was undeniable. Keanu, who had always been the one to help, had found himself in a situation where it wasn't just about saving a life, it was about connecting with another living being in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. Keanu had spent so much of his life alone, away from the spotlight, finding peace in the quiet moments and the simple things. But this was different. This dog, despite everything it had been through, had chosen to stay with him. It was as if the rescue wasn't just about pulling the dog from danger, it was about forming a connection that went beyond the circumstances. As they walked together, Keanu could feel the weight of that unspoken bond. It was a reminder that, sometimes, the most unexpected connections are the most meaningful. The dog had been through a lot, trapped in the swamp and struggling for survival. Yet here it was, walking alongside Keanu, no longer fearful, no longer struggling. Keanu realized that the dog wasn't just grateful for being saved, it had chosen him. In that moment, Keanu understood that this wasn't just a one-sided relationship. They had both been part of something larger than themselves. The rescue had been a catalyst for something neither of them had expected. And as they continued to walk side by side, Keanu felt a sense of peace he hadn't realized he needed. For Keanu, this experience had changed him. It was a reminder that life was full of surprises, and sometimes, the connections we form come when we least expect them. As he looked down at the dog, walking beside him with a calm trust, Keanu couldn't help but smile. This dog had come into his life at a time when he needed something more than just solitude. It was a reminder that we are never truly alone in the world, even when we think we are. The story had come full circle. What had started as a rescue had turned into something much more, a relationship built on trust, survival, and an unexpected connection that neither Keanu nor the dog could have predicted. Keanu knew that their journey together had just begun, and he was ready for whatever came next. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Share this with someone who loves stories of survival, trust, and the bonds we never saw coming.